Shalom, YouTube. So we're going to be continuing where I left off with the Jacob and Esau. I'd just like to say that this fight between Jacob and Esau, it's been an eternal struggle. So remember, Esau wanted to kill Jacob after he took his inheritance. But Esau essentially gave away his inheritance by choosing to marry Hittite women. He knew that these women were wicked. He knew that the Canaanites were wicked. And he allowed himself to fall into that trap. And this was his first mistake. And then Jacob legally bought it from him for the bowl of soup. That was the second nail in the coffin. But the final nail in the coffin, yes, Jacob did deceive his father. And if Jacob had not deceived his father, he still would have gotten the birthright blessing somehow. It's just this is the way the story played out. And because Jacob swindled his brother on it, to his father, this is why maybe that's the reason. Maybe that's the sin where this ancient feud has taken root from. Because regardless, he would have gotten the firstborn status. It was predetermined by God that he would be the firstborn status. It was even prophesied in his name, I believe. But because he did this is an ancient blood feud. So Esau wanted to kill Jacob. Jacob's mother, Rebekah, tells Isaac to send Jacob off to Laban. He works 7 years to marry one of Laban's daughters, but Laban deceives him and gives him the other daughter. He works another 7 years. He gets the daughter he wanted to marry. So he takes these two women and their two maidservants, and from these four women, he produces 12 sons and one daughter, and he becomes very wealthy in livestock and cattle. And he decides, or no, God tells him to go back home. I don't believe Isaac or Rebecca are dead yet, but he goes back home, and on the way home, I believe this is when he has his vision with the Jacob's ladder, or maybe this is before he left to Laban. But regardless, what ends up happening is he wrestles with a man who ends up being basically the angel, the Redeemer, the Christ. And this angel, this man that wrestles with him, says, "Your name should no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For as a man, you have prevailed, and like basically you fought against God. You struggled with God. You prevailed, something like that. I don't remember exactly, but basically Jacob wrestled with this man, and this man let him win. And Jacob realizes that he saw God face to face, and he calls the name of the place Peniel. Now, obviously, he didn't see God's full glory, but he saw a fraction of it. Anyway, so he heads back, and he realized that Esau's sending a huge military attachment to try to kill him. And he's terrified, so he starts praying to God, and he tries to make obeisance to Esau. He's like, I want to give him some gifts to calm his temper. And he basically acts very subservient to Esau, and he gives him a lot of wealth and a lot of livestock, and they reconcile. Temporarily, they reconciled. And so they get back to their homeland, and then in the book of Jubilees, this is missing from Genesis, but it is in Jubilees. And it's also in the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. The Testament of, I believe it was Judah. I think it was Judah chapter 9 or so. But in Jubilees, it's Jubilees 37, Jubilees 38, and I believe it was Judah chapter 9. What ends up happening is that Esau's parents, Jacob and Esau's parents, they basically get them to swear a mutual oath that they will not seek conflict with one another once the parents are dead, that they will love each other as brothers. And they both agreed to it. And at the time, Esau did feel that in his heart, that he's my brother, I love him, I don't have any other brothers. How can I do this to my own brother? No, I love my brother. And so Jacob, Isaac and Rebekah die, and then Esau returns back with his kin. So Esau's got children, Jacob's got children, and Esau's children tempt him to basically hey, how come you don't have the firstborn? How come you didn't get the firstborn inheritance? And he's like, oh, because Jacob, because of the porridge, because of the birthright. When my father was blind. And his sons say, no, screw that. We're going to kill Jacob, and if you don't help us, we're going to hurt you too. And Esau gets really mad about it. And then he starts to think about his anger. And then he rises up against Jacob, and he wants to exterminate him and his seed from the earth. And this is around the time Jacob's wife dies. And so Jacob shoots an arrow and kills Esau, and he buries him. And essentially, Esau's seed is put into subjugation by Jacob's seed after this. But you can only read about this in the book of Jubilees and the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Jacob's sons left final writings on their deathbeds. Very interesting little texts, too. They add a lot of context to Genesis and Jubilees. And some of these actually contain prophecies about the Messiah, how the Messiah is going to be killed, and how he's the Son of God, and all that kind of stuff. So, regardless, so Jacob and Esau, Esau's children, the Edomites, are basically put into subjection unto Jacob's seed until they go off to Egypt. They go off to Egypt around the time that they sell Joseph into slavery. The other sons are very jealous of Joseph, his older brothers. At some point, Dinmah gets raped by a Canaanite, and the sons of Jacob, against his desires, basically go to war against the Canaanites. I believe it was in Shechem, and they just put thousands to death. Like, it was a huge slaughter, a huge battle. And because God fought for the Hebrews, they won. So if you follow the law of Moses, Abraham was a good warrior too. If you obey the law of Moses, God will send angels to fight for you. It's just what it is. So after the battle in Shechem, at some point Joseph's brothers get jealous. They sell him to slavery by Ishmaelite caravan traders. They take him to Egypt, and Potiphar's wife, I believe Potiphar might have been a eunuch, and regardless, Potiphar's wife keeps trying to tempt him, and when he keeps refusing, she lies and said that he raped her, or he tried to rape her, and he gets thrown into the dungeon. And in the dungeon, there's two men. One's a baker, and one is the cupbearer for the king, for the Pharaoh. And they have dreams, and Joseph's known for being able to interpret dreams through the Holy Spirit. And he tells the cupbearer that he will return to Pharaoh, and he tells the baker that he will be killed, and the birds will eat his flesh. And both of these prophecies come out to be true. And at some point, Pharaoh's having a bunch of dreams, and the dreams are disturbing him. And he's like, I need somebody with the Spirit of God that can interpret these dreams. And the cupbearer remembers Joseph in prison, and he tells him about it. And the Pharaoh brings Joseph out of prison, washes him, shaves him, all that stuff, brings him forth to the court. Basically, the dream is that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And Joseph advises the king on what to do about it. And the king takes his advice, and the years of plenty, it's very plenteous. They grab so much food, they put it all into storage. It's wonderful. And then the famine arrives, and the famine is so great it sweeps through the entire land of Canaan also. And Jacob's sons go to Egypt because they need to get food. And in the midst of all this, Joseph realizes who they are. He's a very high man. He has a very high position in Egypt at this time. So he's most likely depicted in one of the Egyptian relics as a god or something. I forgot which one it was, but there is a belief in the Talmud and among some other people that one of the Egyptian gods is actually Joseph. Regardless. So he basically reveals himself to them, and all of the Hebrews move to Egypt, and this is where they all die. Jacob dies there, and all his 12 sons. Afterwards, it seems like there was a regime change in Egypt. It seems like what ends up happening is that a new kingdom conquers Egypt, and they become very troubling to Israel, because Hebrews were very well loved in Egypt. But at some point, some evil force took over Egypt, and they weren't able to give burnt sacrifices. And this is the backstory to Moses. So Moses was the one who was fulfilling the prophecy God gave to Abraham, where he would give the land of Canaan to Abraham and his seed, not to the seed of Ishmael, who was an illegitimate child, but to the seed of Isaac. Isaac, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Esau, not the God of Abraham, Ishmael, and his desert warrior sons. No, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Moses survives death. His mother puts him into a boat. He's a very beautiful baby. His mother puts him into a little boat and casts him down the Nile River to survive because there's an order. It seems like there might have been a prophecy that a child would be born among the Hebrews, and he would save them from slavery. This is why Moses' older brother Aaron was not put to death at his birth. However, and so this seems to keep happening. It happened with Jesus. It seems to have happened with Moses, and it might have also happened with Abraham, but that's not in the Bible or Jubilees, I believe. But it is in a lot of the Talmudic legends. It's in the book of, I don't know if it's really Jasher. It's like partially Jasher. We don't have the original book of Jasher, but we have a Middle Age revised version of it, which is definitely tampered with, but it has a lot of details that do line up with the Bible and with the Talmud. And I know the Talmud's got a lot of wicked stuff about it against Jesus, and it's got a lot of heresies. So I treat the Talmud as like a book of like a history book at best. It's a history book. It's the opinions of the rabbis. It's not a holy book. You should not treat the Talmud as a holy book. However, for gaining wisdom about history, about because we don't know that much about Abraham from the Bible. Genesis doesn't say much about his early childhood. Same with Moses. By Exodus chapter 2, Moses has already fled Egypt because he killed a man. So we don't know any, and he's 40 years old at this point. So 40 years of Moses' life depicted in 2 chapters is not a very, where's the rest of it? So, anyways, Moses at some point realizes he's a Hebrew. That's not explained either. And he sees one of his fellow Hebrews being tormented by an Egyptian taskmaster, and he kills the Egyptian taskmaster and buries him in the sand. And when he realizes that other people are aware of it, he has to flee. And he flees to the land of the Midianites, which is northwestern Saudi Arabia. And he stays with a priest of Midian, and he takes one of his daughters as a wife. And I believe he's following a sheep that's strayed off, or that might just be what the movie The Prince of Egypt said. But at some point, he gets into Mount Horeb, which is Jabal Machla. Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, Jabal Machla. Jabal Machla is what the Arabians call it. Basically, it's a burnt mountain. God melted this mountain when he spoke the Ten Commandments. And this is where he first comes into contact with God. It says, the angel of the Lord was in the burning bush, and then God spoke from the burning bush. So the angel of the Lord is most likely Christ in this circumstance. But basically, Moses is called to be a prophet. He's told that he's going to tell Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go out for 3 days to give burnt sacrifices, and then the Hebrews will return. And he's told to do some miracles to convince the Hebrews that he was sent by God, and that if Pharaoh won't listen, that God will send plagues after him. Pharaoh doesn't listen, so God sends multiple plagues, and the final plague is the beginning of the Passover feast. So there was no Passover, as far as I can tell, from any of the books I've read, Jubilees, anything. Passover originated with Moses, and this is part of the law of Moses. So what we see is before Moses, there were less steps to the law, and after Moses, the law was practically complete. There were only a few things that had to be added to it. One of those things was the temple had to be built where God's glory would rest in one place forever. And another thing that had to happen was the crucifixion and the baptism and the communion wine and the communion bread. And that's it. The law of Moses, the blood of Christ, it's complete now. There's nothing more to add to it. This is why Islam is so dangerous, because not only does it deny the New Testament, but it also denies the Old Testament. And a lot of people fall for it. And they worship a Quraysh god instead of Yahweh. Okay, so Moses returns to Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't believe there's 10 plagues. The 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. And they have to kill a goat or a sheep on I think it was the 14th or 15th of Nisan. And they put the blood on the door hinges, and they roast it with fire, and they eat it. And this is the beginning of the Passover feast. And this Passover feast is the exact same date that Jesus was crucified. When the sun sets, that's the beginning of the day in the Hebrew calendar. And that very day that the sun set, where Moses ate the roast lamb, from that sunset to the next sunset, that's the very same day that Christ was crucified, on the first day of Passover. So the firstborn of all Egypt is killed because Pharaoh's heart is so stubborn he will not relent, and he finally agrees to let them go. And the Egyptians are so, so terrified and so awestruck by how powerful they are that they give him all kinds of wealth to leave. And this is recorded in the Ipuwer Papyrus, Ipuwer Papyrus. It's an Egyptian text talking about, like, there's blood, the waters have turned to blood, and the slaves have looted their masters. It's like there's chaos and death and destruction. And it lines up pretty closely with the 10 plagues. So that's a very interesting text. I haven't read the whole thing, but I have seen some of it, and it does definitely mention that the waters have turned to blood, and the slaves have basically become wealthy at the expense of their owners, which is exactly what it says in Exodus. So they leave, and they're very happy, and then Pharaoh becomes demon-possessed again, and he's like, okay, no, I can't let these people leave. So he chases after them, he sends a military attaché after them, and they cross the Red Sea. God opens the Red Sea up, and the Red Sea collapses on Pharaoh and his men, and Moses sings a song talking about how great is my God is a man of war. Trembling shall take hold of the Philistines, and the Canaanites will see it and quake with fear. No, he doesn't say Philistines, he says Palestiners. So basically, it's the same word, but that's the King James Bible. It says Palestine, but Palestine and Philistines, the same thing. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, that's Jordan. Like, you have to understand the geography of the Bible. You have to understand the genealogies of the Bible to understand why Israel has always been fought against by these same people. Anyway, so God tells Moses to go up the mountain, to sanctify the people, to prepare them, to wash their clothes and prepare themselves, and then God's going to reveal himself. And this is the Ten Commandments. This is Exodus 19 and 20. So God speaks the Ten Commandments. I am Yahweh your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Allah. You shall not make graven images. Read the text. And after the Ten Commandments, the Hebrews are terrified, and they're like, Moses, you go up and talk to God, and we'll listen to you. But don't let God talk to us, because we're terrified and we're going to die. And Moses says, God is proving you. He's showing to you his power so that you will not sin against him. And God gives a few more instructions. Don't make images of gold or silver. And then he says, an altar of earth thou shalt make. So God explicitly says you must give burnt sacrifices, which is essentially what the Passover feast was. When they roast the lamb, when they kill the lamb and they roast it, that is the Passover feast, which is a burnt sacrifice. Anyway, so what ends up happening is Moses goes up the mountain to talk to God, and he's giving him many instructions, many laws. And the Book of Jubilees claims that this is when, during the 40 days Moses was on the mountain, the Book of Jubilees claims that this is when God told him basically the story of Genesis and up until the early parts of Exodus. And during this time, the Hebrews become anxious. It's only been like 40 days, and they tell Aaron to make them gods of gold. And it seems like they might have threatened Aaron. It's not quite clear. But he ends up taking all their gold earrings, and he molds it into a golden calf, and they worship it. They give it burnt sacrifices. So they basically made a god with their own hands that has no power, because they didn't want to be patient for the God that does have power, who led them out of Egypt, who's talking to Moses on the mountain. And Moses actually ends up seeing the face, not the whole face of God, but he sees the glory of God. He sees God's glory from behind him and from the cleft of the rock and from the back of his hand. So he only sees part of God's glory, and it makes Moses glow like an angel. And they have to put a veil over his face when he talks to the Hebrews. But that's later on in the story. So he's up in the mountain, and then God tells Moses, like, I'm so angry with these people. They're worshiping a golden calf. Leave me alone. Let me kill them, and I'll make a greater civilization from you than from them. And Moses pleads with God and says, what will the Egyptians think? What will the Canaanites think? And so Moses successfully asks God to show mercy, which is, I suppose, very similar to Moses fulfills in many ways the role that Christ fulfills later on. Moses is like leading the Hebrews like a flock, and he's also pleading with God for mercy for his people. And so what ends up happening later on is he comes down the mountain, and all the people who are worshiping the golden calf, or at least many of them, were put to death. He grinds up the calf into dust, and he makes them drink it. So he ends up receiving the rest of the commandments, and God tells him to basically build the Ark of the Covenant in a house for God. This is the tabernacle. This is a very important part of the story, because God's glory dwelled in the tabernacle, and there was a giant flame. By night there was a flame, and by day there was a cloud. And everybody could see this. You couldn't fake this. You couldn't pretend that this was real. There was literally a giant flame and a giant cloud inside this house everywhere they went, because the glory of God was contained in the Ark of the Covenant, which was contained in the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was like a prototype for the temple. So then Leviticus, God gives a bunch of instructions, a bunch of laws for burnt sacrifices, and that's more or less what that is. Book of Numbers, it's kind of just some of their battles. They're conquering a bunch of these Canaanites. And the most important part of Numbers, in my opinion, is the story of Balaam and Balak. So the Midianites and the Moabites are terrified of the Hebrews. And so King Balak of Moab, he and the Midianites put money together to get Balaam, son of Beor. I made a video on him recently. Balaam, son of Beor, they contract him to basically put a curse on the Hebrews, because they know that he has powers as a prophet. So he comes and he gives burnt sacrifices, but every time he tries to curse them, God puts a blessing in his mouth instead. And it's implied in this book, and it's explicitly mentioned in other books, that Balaam basically tells Balak, if you want to curse these people, you have to basically seduce them away from obeying the commandments of God. They cannot obey the commandments of God. If they obey their commandments if they obey the law of Moses, you can't touch them. So if you can get them to transgress the commandments, then they're just like everybody else. So Balak seduces them with Midianite women, and they eat they eat the sacrifices to their gods, and they fall down and worship their gods. And God is so angry that there's a plague, and the only way to get rid of the plague is basically to kill the people who transgress this commandment, and then it stops. And so God basically tells Moses to smite the Midianites, for they seduce you with their witchcrafts. And then it kind of goes on a little bit more of that. So, they pitch here, they pitch there. The Hebrews were camping for 40 years in the wilderness because they wouldn't obey. God sends they send some scouts to search out the land of Canaan, and they see it's a very good land. It should have only been like a 40-day trip, but because they disobeyed God, it ends up taking 40 years. And at the end of the 40 years, only Joshua and the younger generation. I think it was everybody under 20 years old or 40 years old doesn't get to come inside of the Holy Land. Okay, so they finally get to the Holy Land after the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is basically just the law of Moses. It's just like, it's the book of the law. Definitely my most favorite book of the Bible is definitely Deuteronomy, because it just explains in very good detail what God expects from us. Moses is speaking, and then he gives a prophecy in chapter 32 about how the world is going to play out up until Armageddon. He goes up the mountain and he dies, and then Joshua takes over. And God basically raises up Joshua as a prophet, and he tells Joshua, don't forget the book of the law of Moses, the book of Deuteronomy. This is your salvation. And so Joshua goes around conquering a bunch of these Canaanites. He doesn't conquer the entire territory, and then he dies. And then you get to the book of Judges, and this is where all the chaos starts to happen, because God told the Hebrews not to make any covenants with these Canaanites, but to utterly cleanse them from the Holy Land, to cast them out, destroy their altars. Don't make any covenants with them. Don't make any trade deals, nothing with them. But the Hebrews take some of them as slaves, and they start disobeying God. And then the angel of the Lord shows up, and he's like, I would never break my covenant with you. Why have you disobeyed my voice? Because you have done this, I will leave some of them here to test you, and we will see if you love me or not. And so they weep and they give burnt sacrifices. And the angel of the Lord says, I will leave the Philistines and a few others. And the Philistines are essentially the Palestinians, who have been at war with the Hebrews for about 3,500 years. Actually longer. When Esau tries to exterminate Jacob and his sons, when the Edomites try to kill the Israelites, Esau raises up mercenaries of the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Chittim, the Arameans of Cyprus, the Arameans of Syria, the Chittim of Cyprus. Like, he raises a huge mercenary army to try to kill Israel. So, anyways, so the Philistines are causing a lot of problems. The judges period was very chaotic. The Hebrews obey God, and then everything goes well for them. They disobey God, they get conquered, and it just keeps happening over and over again. My favorite story in the Judges is going to be Gideon. Gideon gives a burnt sacrifice to God and becomes a prophet because of it, and God leads him to victory against the Ishmaelites and the Amalekites. And it's a very interesting story. God only needed like 300 of these people to conquer tens of thousands of enemies of Israel. So Gideon's my favorite, and it keeps going like this. Judges. Oh, and Gideon's also there's a historical artifact of Gideon. It's called it's like a clay pot that has his nickname Jerubbaal, because he broke an altar of Baal. They called him Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend against him. So they found a clay pot with Jerubbaal on it around the time that he died, which is really cool. Okay, so we get to Samson. Samson's mother is barren. She prays to God, and she says, if you give me a son, I will dedicate him to you. I believe she's from the Levite tribe. And God gives her a child, and she weans him, and then she basically gives him to the temple. And so Samson's like a little baby boy. He's like 7 years old. He's got a little coat, and he's doing he's a little baby priest. It's adorable. This little boy is living in the temple. He's doing the priesthood with God. It's beautiful. And so God ends up speaking to him. And at one point, God straight up says, Samson, Samson, and he doesn't realize it's God speaking to him. He thinks it's his uncle Eli, or grandfather or father Eli. And so after 3 times, he realizes that God is speaking to him, and God basically gives him instructions, and Samson becomes a very great prophet. And Samson's the one that anoints King Saul. The people cry out that we want a king like the Gentiles, and God is upset with them because it's like they didn't reject you, they rejected me. And so they anoint King Saul as a king, but he doesn't obey God. When God tells him to exterminate the Amalekites for their wickedness, he chooses not to, and he keeps the best of their livestock and all that stuff. And so the kingdom is basically taken away from Saul, and it's going to be given to David. David's just a little shepherd boy, just tending to the flock, but he has extreme faith in God. And I'd say King David is the greatest king that Israel ever had. Second best would be King Solomon, but you can't really say he's the best one because Solomon went crazy with the pagan wives. But King David, basically, God makes a covenant with King David that his kingdom will last forever, and that the Messiah will come from his loins and all that stuff. And so, on his deathbed, he makes Solomon the heir, and Solomon's the one who builds the temple. He contracts a bunch of and Solomon's temple, Solomon's kingdom was the greatest civilization to ever exist. Up until the point where Solomon went crazy with the pagan wives, because the pagan wives seduced him, and he built altars to their gods, and he sacrificed to their gods. And then the Holy Spirit departed from Solomon. But before that point, Solomon's kingdom was the greatest civilization to ever live, to ever exist. We haven't had anything remotely close to it yet. The Messianic kingdom will make Solomon's kingdom look like a joke. So after Solomon's death, Israel becomes extremely corrupted. His kids, basically civil war and chaos and paganism and worshiping golden gods again. And it keeps happening like this. And the prophet Elijah restores things for a little bit. And he does the burnt sacrifice where fire falls from heaven. Everybody knows that Yahweh is God, not Baal. But it just keeps happening like this. And then Jeremiah is basically like a little kid, maybe like a young teenager, and God basically tells him, like, you need to warn these people because there's going to be a horrible thing coming. And it happened with Babylon. The Babylonian captivity, the temple's destroyed, they're taken away. And this is like the beginning of Israel realizing, well, they didn't really realize, they never learned from their mistakes, but it's like God basically disinherited Israel for 70 years. He let them rot in exile for 70 years until he brought them back. So then we get all the stories of like Daniel and Esther and all these prophets from us. They're in Persia and they're in Babylon. All these stories happen during those 70 years. And a lot of these, the Book of Daniel is very interesting. The Book of Daniel talks about like Messianic kingdom prophecies, talks about, like the Babylonian Empire's gold. And then after Babylon comes Persia. I need to drink some water. Give me a second. Okay. So, King Nebuchadnezzar has some dreams, and Daniel interprets these dreams, and these dreams all have end times prophecy implications. And one of these dreams is about the statue. And the statue's got a head of gold, which represents Babylon, and it's got shoulders and arms of silver, which represents the Medo-Persians, and it's got legs of brass, which represents the Greeks, and it's got feet of iron. It's got iron and clay is like the fourth kingdom, which ends up being the Roman Empire and everything that comes from Rome. So we're currently living in the fourth kingdom. Basically, one empire leads into the next, and each empire is less glorious than the one before it. And the final empire, it's like all the races will be mixed together, but they will not join one to another. And then there's going to be a mountain, and a rock will be cut out of the mountain, and the rock will smash the toes, and the whole empire will collapse. And this is the Messianic kingdom. And so Daniel has a bunch of these prophecies. One of his prophecies is even about the Messiah being executed in Daniel 9:26, and the temple being destroyed, and Jerusalem being destroyed again by the Romans. So we get a bunch of these kinds of events. The Book of Esther, the Amalekite king, the Amalekite Agagite Haman wants to exterminate the Hebrews in Persia and the Persian Empire, but Esther ends up convincing the king not to. The king realizes that Haman is an enemy, and the Hebrews fight back, and they kill many of their enemies, and this is the history of Purim. So Purim is basically a holiday about how the Hebrews killed their enemies before their enemies could kill them. Very important to note. So after 70 years, the Persians bring them back from captivity, help them to build their temple, but the temple's not nearly as glorious as it was in King Solomon's day. And this is the book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra, and the apocryphal Ezra 1, Ezra 2. And so there's a lot of prophecy about this time period. This is Second Temple period is more or less where the history books like to say that Judaism really began. The official story the archaeologists talk about, they don't really believe in the First Temple period. They think it was all paganism and that the monotheism only started in the Second Temple. But the historians are liars. The world is controlled by pagans who lie about everything. I did not evolve from a fish that became a monkey that became a human. I'll tell you that straight up. Everything that the scientists say is more or less a lie. Gender theory, vaccine theory, it's all bullshit. It's all a lie. So, um, so the Second Temple, they dedicated with burnt sacrifices. I think it was Nehemiah or Ezra reads the book of the law of Moses to them, Deuteronomy. He reads it in front of them, and they realize how important it is. And, it starts off good, but it ends up going badly pretty quickly. They all start sinning again. And what ends up happening is things go from bad to worse. And then basically, this is the period where all the last prophets, the book of Malachi was written around the time of Ezra. So at some point in the Second Temple, there was no more prophecy with the book of Malachi. And many people think Malachi was written by Ezra. And I think it could be legit. So the prophecies sealed up, and this is one of the prophecies actually, that there will be no more prophecy, that the prophets will basically no longer be able to, there's going to be no more prophets. The prophets will be made to not be able to see anymore, that there's going to be a book and you won't be able to read it, and that's all there is to it. So, book of Malachi, about 400 before Christ, that was the last prophet. And then what ends up happening later on is the Greek Empire takes over, and we know about the book of Maccabees. The books of Maccabees, very well documented period in history where they basically tried to exterminate Judaism, the Torah, all the Hebrew texts. They tried to burn them all out of existence, and many texts were lost in this period of time. On top of the texts that were destroyed when the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians and the Edomites. I think it was the Edomites who actually destroyed the temple. Babylonians just conquered Israel, but somebody actually wanted the temple destroyed. And from the book of Obadiah and from some of the Psalms, it seems like this was the Edomites. So many texts were destroyed in all these wars. Every time Israel is conquered, a little piece of their history goes missing if they're like fully, scorched earth conquered. So we get to the books of Maccabees. Antiochus Epiphanes is literally exterminating Judaism off the face of the earth. Anybody who follows the law of Moses is put to death. They're being forced to eat pork. It's really horrible. It's the same stuff the Romans were doing to the Christians. Second Maccabees chapter 6 and 7, they're basically defiling the temple of God, and they're dedicating it to Zeus worship. Zeus and Jupiter are the same God, and it seems like Allah is also this same God. It's basically where Satan's going to come from. Satan's going to be able to come out. The abomination of desolation will stand in the holy place because of some satanic ritual in the house of God or something. I'm not fully understanding of it, but basically Mount Zion is holy forever, and they will basically use Mount Zion, this holy site, as a portal to let Satan out from hell. That's what it seems like to me. All right, so they end up winning the war against the Greeks, and at some point they make a league with the Romans, and the Romans betray them, and this is the backstory for how Jesus comes about in Roman captivity. So I think this will be a good place to stop it. We'll pick up with the New Testament in the next segment, but essentially from Genesis until Maccabees is the entire story of the Old Testament. If you're not reading the book of Maccabees, you're missing out on a lot of very important context. You cannot understand the Bible without understanding the story of the book of Maccabees, because many of the manuscripts, the historical texts, the eyewitness testimonies, so much of that stuff was lost. And the story of how that stuff was lost is written in the book of Maccabees. And even the historians do not contest that the Greeks tried to destroy Judaism. They were just like, well, it must have been a misunderstanding. I can't understand why they would be trying to destroy their religion, why they would be trying to kill people for not eating pork. So, they really showed their hand. Satan revealed his hand in the books of Maccabees. If you read the books of Maccabees, it will strengthen your faith in the law of Moses. And the very same law of Moses Christ told us to keep. So I'll leave it off here. God bless. We are Adam. and we just have to stick out our hand, and God will be there for us. God will always meet us halfway if we reach out for Him.